The chandeliers inside the Grand Hyatt ballroom were so bright they almost hurt the eyes. They cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of headsmen in expensive tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns. It was the kind of night where people didn't just walk, they glided. The air smelled like expensive perfume, rare flowers, and the faint scent of money. This was the annual charity gala for the city's elite, a place where connections were made and donations were signed with zeros that looked like phone numbers. Julian. Thorne stood near the front of the room, holding a glass of champagne he hadn't taken a sip of in 20 minutes. He was a man who commanded attention without trying. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. And he carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you are the best in the room. Julian wasn't just rich. He was a prodigy. By the age of 6, he was playing concertos. By 18, he was performing in sold-out halls across Europe. Now, in his 30s, he was widely considered one of the greatest pianists of his generation. But tonight, Julian was bored. He nodded politely as a gray-haired man in a bow tie droned on about stock market fluctuations. Julian's eyes wandered over the crowd. He saw diamonds, fake smiles, and heard the constant hum of polite laughter. He felt a familiar itch in his fingers. He wanted to be at the piano. He didn't want to stand here and pretend to care about hedge funds. "Excuse me," Julian said smoothly, interrupting the man in the bow tie. "I believe I see an old friend." He didn't, of course. It was just a polite way to escape. Julian slipped through the crowd, moving like a shark through a reef. He needed air, or at least a quieter corner. His path took him toward the far side of the hall, away from the main stage, where the room opened up into a more intimate lounge area. That's where he saw it. A sleek black Steinway grand piano sat alone in the corner. It was polished to a mirror shine, looking like a piece of dark jewelry. But it wasn't the piano that made Julian stop in his tracks. It was the woman sitting in front of it. She wasn't dressed like the other women. There were no diamonds on her neck, and her dress was a simple, flowing navy blue that looked like it had been bought at a department store, not a high-end boutique. Her hair was pulled back loosely, exposing a face that was plain but kind. She looked completely out of place among the glitz and glamour. Like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a peacock convention, the woman wasn't playing the piano. She was just sitting on the bench, staring at the keys. Her hands rested lightly on her knees. Every so often, she would reach out and press a single key, listen to the sound fade into the noisy room, and then pull her hand back as if she were touching a hot stove. Julian watched her for a moment, intrigued. He assumed she was waiting for someone, maybe a musician hired for the event who was running late. He walked over, his leather shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. "It's a shame to let an instrument like that just sit there," Julian said. His voice was deep and carried the hint of an accent he'd picked up while studying abroad. The woman jumped slightly, turning around on the bench. Her eyes were wide and brown, looking a little startled. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to touch it. I was just looking." Julian smiled, the kind of smile he usually gave interviewers, a mix of charm and superiority. "No need to apologize. It is meant to be played." "Do you play?" The woman hesitated. She looked down at her hands, which were rough and lacked the manicures of the other guests in the room. "A little," she said softly. "Not like the people here, just—" "For myself," Julian raised an eyebrow. He loved amateurs. They were usually harmless, but occasionally they were fun to play with. He leaned against the side of the piano, crossing his arms. "I'm Julian," he said. He didn't offer his last name. He didn't need to. "I couldn't help but notice you looked a bit terrified of it." She gave a small, shy laugh. "Ilara," she replied. "And yes, I suppose I am. Pianos like this belong in museums, not under my hands." "Nonsense," Julian said, waving his hand dismissively. "Music belongs to whoever has the courage to play it." But looking at this crowd, he gestured vaguely toward the main room. "I doubt anyone here is really listening. They are too busy listening to the sound of their own voices." Ilara glanced back toward the party, looking uncomfortable. "It's very nice. I'm just here helping with the catering setup in the back, but my break isn't over yet." I should probably go. You aren't performing? Julian asked, surprised. No, I definitely am not, she said, shaking her head firmly. I just helped set the tables. Julian felt a spark of mischief. He was bored, he was rich, and he was the best pianist in the room. This was the perfect recipe for some entertainment. He looked at the piano, then back at Alara. He wanted to prove a point that technical skill was the only thing that mattered. And that feeling without technique was just noise. Tell you what. Alara, Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The charity auction is starting in 20 minutes. I was actually supposed to play a small piece to warm up the crowd, but I find them terribly stuffy. How about a trade? Alara looked suspicious. What kind of trade? I will make a donation to the charity in your name. A large one, Julian said, naming a figure that made Alara's eyes go wide. All you have to do is sit down and play something for me. Right now here. She squeaked. Now. In front of everyone. Why not? It's quiet enough over here that only a few might notice, but loud enough to matter, Julian challenged. Unless, of course, you can't play anything worth hearing. Alara bit her lip. She looked at the beautiful black and white keys. She looked at Julian, who was smiling like a man who knew he had already won. She knew she shouldn't. She knew she didn't belong in that world. But the money he was offering? It would pay her rent for 6 months. It would help her mom with the medicine she needed. I can try, Alara stammered, but I don't know any songs. I don't read music. Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound. You don't read music? Then how do you expect to play? Alara's expression hardened just a fraction. Her chin came up. I listen, she said simply. And I remember. Julian's smirk widened. This was perfect. He was going to show this simple woman that without years of grueling practice, without the scales and the theory, her remembering would be nothing but a mess. He stepped back and gestured to the bench with a flourish, like a magician revealing a trick. Be my guest, Julian said. Let's see what you have. Alara took a deep breath. She smoothed the fabric of her simple dress. She sat back down on the bench. The piano suddenly felt much bigger than it had a moment ago. She could feel Julian's eyes on her, judging her. Waiting for her to fail so he could go back to his friends and tell a funny story about the catering girl who tried to play the piano. She placed her hands on the keys. They were trembling slightly. She didn't know Mozart. She didn't know Chopin. She didn't know the complicated, structured songs that Julian dedicated his life to. But she knew a sound. She knew a rhythm that had played in the back of her mind every night for the last 10 years. She closed her eyes to block out the shiny room and the arrogant man watching her. She took one more breath, held it, and let her fingers fall. The ballroom felt incredibly quiet, even though people were still talking and laughing just 50 feet away. It felt like the air around the piano had been sucked into a vacuum, separating Alara and Julian from the rest of the party. Julian stood with his arms crossed, his foot tapping gently against the polished floor. He wasn't tapping to a beat. He was tapping out his impatience. He looked at his watch, then back at the woman sitting at the instrument. He expected her to fumble. He expected her to poke out a hesitant version of Happy Birthday, or perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That was usually what happened when people claimed they played by ear but had no training. They could pick out a melody, but it lacked soul, depth, and rhythm. Alara's hands hovered over the keys. They looked small and slightly rough, the hands of someone who washed dishes and scrubbed floors for a living. They were not the elegant, long-fingered hands of a concert pianist. Julian felt a pang of pity mixed with his arrogance. He was about to make a fool of her, but at least the charity would get the money. He shifted his weight, ready to clap sarcastically after the first few wrong notes. You don't have to play a masterpiece, Julian said, breaking the silence. His voice was smooth, but carried a sharp edge. Just play something recognizable. Maybe a simple folk song. That would be appropriate, don't you think? Alara didn't open her eyes. She shook her head very slightly. She didn't want to play a folk song. She didn't want to play a nursery rhyme. The longer she sat there, the more the nervousness in her chest began to change. It hardened into something else. It wasn't quite confidence, but it was a need to be heard. These people in this room, with their expensive clothes and their shallow conversations, would never understand her life. They would never understand the world she came from. She couldn't explain it with words because she didn't have the fancy vocabulary they used. But she had this. She had the memory of sound. "No," she whispered, so softly that Julian almost didn't hear her. "No." Julian stepped closer, intrigued by her defiance. "Then what? Do you know jazz? Blues?" "It's not a song," Alara said, finally opening her eyes and looking straight at the ivory keys. "It's just a feeling. A picture." Julian let out a short, dismissive breath. "Music is structure, Alara. It is math. It is physics. You cannot just play a picture, but please, go ahead, try." Alara ignored him. She knew he was waiting for her to crash and burn. She knew that in a few moments, he would likely laugh and walk away. But for some reason, it didn't matter anymore. She thought about the small, drafty apartment she grew up in. She thought about the leaky roof that made a rhythm of its own when it rained. She thought about the sound of the train passing by at midnight, the lonely horn echoing through the valley. She placed her left hand on the low notes. Her fingers were stiff at first, cold with anxiety. She pressed down 3 keys together. A deep, heavy chord rolled out of the piano. It wasn't pretty in the traditional sense. It was dark. It sounded like a door slamming shut in an empty house. Julian raised an eyebrow. He stopped tapping his foot. That chord. It wasn't standard. It wasn't a C major or in a minor. It was something dissonant, something that grated against the ear just enough to make you lean in and wonder why it hurt so good. Alara didn't stop. Her right hand began to move. It didn't dance lightly over the keys like a ballerina. It marched like a soldier. The notes came out slowly, one by one. It sounded like a conversation between 2 people who were arguing but trying not to wake the neighbors. Julian listened, waiting for her to lose the timing. He was a master of time signatures. He knew exactly where the beat should fall. But Alara wasn't playing to a beat. She was playing to a pulse that only she could hear. And somehow it worked. It had a ragged, uneven flow, like a river flowing over rocks. It felt dangerous. Julian uncrossed his arms. He stood up straight. The smirk on his face began to fade, replaced by a look of confusion. He was trying to analyze the progression. He was trying to predict what note would come next. Based on the theory he had spent 30 years mastering, he couldn't predict it. The music twisted. It turned a corner he didn't expect. A melody started to emerge from the bass notes, something fragile and broken, climbing up the scale like a vine trying to reach the sun through a crack in the pavement. It wasn't fast. It wasn't showing off technical skill. In fact, her fingering was clumsy. She used her thumb when she should have used her pinky. She slurred notes together that should have been distinct. Julian wanted to criticize it. He wanted to point out her mistakes. But the strange thing was, the mistakes made the music sound real. It sounded human. It sounded like someone stumbling through life, tripping, getting up, and keeping walking. Every time she hit a wrong note, it added to the story. It sounded like regret. A few waiters passing by slowed down to listen. They balanced heavy trays on their shoulders but forgot to move toward the tables. The sound was pulling them in. It wasn't the polite, boring background music they were used to hearing at these events. The sound demanded attention. It felt like a secret being shouted in a crowded room. Julian took another step closer. He was now standing right beside the piano. He looked down at Alara's face. Her eyes were closed again, her eyebrows furrowed together as if she were in pain. She wasn't thinking about the keys. She was somewhere else entirely. She was channeling something that had nothing to do with this fancy hotel. She was playing the sound of hunger, the sound of waiting, the sound of hope that is just a little too late. "What is this?" Julian muttered to himself. He was no longer bored. He was unnerved. The melody shifted. The heavy bass note stopped, and the music became lighter, high up in the treble clef. It sounded like wind chimes on a breezy day, but there was a sadness underneath it. It sounded like a memory of a happy time that you know will never happen again. Julian felt a strange tightness in his chest. He told himself it was just the acoustics in the room, or perhaps the champagne finally hitting him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was the music. It was telling a story he didn't know, but he felt it in his bones. He realized then that he wasn't the player anymore. He was the audience, and he had no control over what happened next. Ilara took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling. She was about to transition into the middle part of the story, the part where the storm hits. She flexed her fingers, preparing to strike the keys with a force that no one expected from a woman in a simple navy dress. Julian watched her hands. Frozen by the anticipation, he had challenged a simple lady, expecting a joke. Instead, she was giving him a lesson. And for the first time in his life, the great Julian Thorne didn't know what to do. The mood in the corner of the ballroom shifted the moment Elira's hands moved into the next measure. The light, wind chime sound from the treble keys didn't fade away gently. It was cut off by a sharp, jagged note that acted like a knife through the atmosphere. It was the musical equivalent of a door slamming in a gale. Julian physically flinched. He was used to smooth transitions, the polite way composers moved from one idea to the next. This was rude. It was abrupt. And it was absolutely arresting. Ilara's posture changed. She was no longer the shy woman hunched over the keys, afraid to be heard. Her back straightened, and her hands lifted higher above the keyboard. For a moment, they hovered there, trembling with tension, like a sprinter waiting for the gun. Then she brought them down. The sound that erupted wasn't just loud, it was heavy. It wasn't a banging noise like a child pounding on the instrument. It was controlled, thunderous resonance. She was playing deep chords in the left hand, rolling them like thunder across a valley. With her right hand, she began to play a frantic, scrambling melody. It sounded exactly like rain starting to fall. First a few heavy drops, then a downpour. Julian stepped back, almost as if the heat from the piano was pushing him away. He looked from the keys to Ilara's face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her jaw tight. She wasn't reading music. She wasn't counting beats. She was remembering. She was remembering the sound of the tin roof on the old house she grew up in, the way the rain would drum against it when the storms rolled in off the ocean. He knew this sound. He knew rain. But he had only heard it described in Debussy or Chopin Pretty, idealized rain that fell on Parisian boulevards. This was different. This was cold, soaking rain that leaked into your shoes and chilled your bones. It was the sound of worrying if the roof would hold. It was the sound of poverty and uncertainty, and it was terrifyingly beautiful. As the rhythm built, it became complex. The left hand kept a steady, driving pulse thump-thump, while the right hand wove chaotic patterns around it. It reminded Julian of a train. It was the chug of the engine building up speed, the clickety-clack of the wheels on the track. He watched her fingers closely. Technically, they shouldn't have been able to keep up. She was crossing her hands awkwardly, using her thumb where a teacher would demand a pinky, stretching distances that seemed impossible for someone with small hands. Yet the sound was seamless. The mistakes in her technique vanished, swallowed by the sheer power of the narrative. Julian found himself holding his breath. He was a master of theory. He could look at a sheet of paper and tell you exactly what emotion the composer intended to convey. He knew that minor keys were sad and major keys were happy. But Ilara was breaking all those rules. She was playing in a key that felt unresolved, hovering between minor and major, creating a tension that made Julian's teeth ache. Around them, the music began to spill over into the rest of the room. It wasn't just background noise anymore. The sheer volume and intensity of the piano were cutting through the chatter of the elite guests. One by one, heads began to turn. The man in the bow tie stopped talking about stocks. A woman holding a glass of red wine paused, the glass halfway to her lips, her eyes drawn to the corner of the room. Julian saw a waiter freeze in the middle of the room. A heavy tray of champagne balanced on his shoulder. He was looking toward Ilara, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't the look of someone enjoying a concert. It was the look of someone recognizing a voice they hadn't heard in years. Who is that? A woman whispered loudly to her date. I don't know, the man replied. A caterer, maybe? But listen to that. The music shifted again. The frantic, chaotic rain slowed down. The heavy left-hand chords softened, becoming more distant. The melody in the right hand became sparse, lonely. It was no longer a storm. It was the silence after the storm, when the water drips from the eaves and the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement. It was the feeling of being alone in a quiet house at 3 a.m. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He fought it down, annoyed at himself. He was a professional. He didn't get emotional over amateur playing. But this wasn't just playing. It was a confession. Ilara was pouring her life history into those 88 keys. She was telling the room about the nights she went hungry, the days she worked until her hands bled. The loneliness of watching the world go by from a window. He looked at her hands again. They were moving with a ghostly grace now, barely touching the keys, whispering the notes. It was a complete contradiction to the force she had used just moments before. The dynamic range, the difference between the loud and the soft was massive. Julian knew how hard that was to do. To play that loudly without losing control, and then to drop immediately to a whisper that could still be heard at the back of the room. That took a genius he didn't possess. He had spent his entire life trying to perfect the mechanics of the piano. He spent hours practicing scales so his fingers would be perfectly even. He wanted his playing to be flawless, like a diamond. But Ilara's playing was like a raw, uncut stone. It had rough edges. It was messy. But it had a fire inside it that a flawless diamond would never have. The music began to climb. It started low in the bass, crept up through the middle register, and was now rising toward the high notes. It sounded like a bird trying to fly out of a cage. The notes became faster, desperate, reaching for something just out of reach. The tension in the room was unbearable now. People had stopped moving entirely. A small crowd had gathered near the piano, standing in a wide circle. Watching the woman in the navy blue dress, Julian stood rooted to the spot. He realized that he wasn't just hearing music. He was feeling a truth he had never encountered in his sheltered, wealthy life. He traveled in private jets and stayed in five-star hotels. He had never heard the rain on a tin roof. He had never felt the desperate scramble of a train leaving the station, taking someone away that he loved. Ilara was showing him a world he didn't know. She was doing it with an instrument he thought he owned. She reached the climax of the phrase. Her hands stretched to the very top of the keyboard, playing a series of high, ringing notes that sounded like bells, or maybe like stars, shattering in the sky. It was the most beautiful, terrible sound Julian had ever heard. It was the sound of hope and hopelessness crashing into each other. And then, just as the music seemed like it couldn't go any higher, just as it felt like the emotion would explode out of the piano, it stopped. Not with a bang. Not with a final, resolving chord to make everyone feel safe. It stopped on a single, dissonant note that hung in the air, trembling, refusing to resolve. It was a question without an answer. Silence rushed back into the ballroom, heavier than before. The piano strings vibrated, humming the ghost of the sound. Ilara kept her hands pressed down on that last key, her shoulders shaking slightly. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. Julian stared at her. He felt cold, despite the warmth of the room. The arrogant smirk he had worn at the beginning of the night was long gone. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the Steinway, then at the woman, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. He felt like he had been stripped naked, his technical skill revealed as something hollow and empty compared to the raw, bleeding heart of what Ilara had just played. He wasn't bored anymore. He was frozen, trapped in the wake of a storm he never saw coming. The silence that followed the final hanging note was heavy and thick, like a blanket of snow that had suddenly fallen on the room. It wasn't just that the music had stopped. It was that the air inside the Grand Hyatt ballroom had changed. Before, the air had been filled with the chatter of gossip, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the polite, hollow laughter of wealthy people trying to impress each other. Now, all of that was gone. The silence felt alive. It pressed against everyone's ears, demanding that they listen to the nothingness. Ilara sat still on the bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She wasn't moving. Her head was bowed slightly, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She looked like a runner who had just sprinted a mile and was finally coming to a stop. To the people watching, she looked small and fragile. Yet she had just commanded the room with more power than the mayor or the orchestra conductor combined. Julian stood rooted to the spot, just a few feet away from the piano. He felt strange, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. His heart was hammering against his ribs, which was ridiculous. He was a performer. He played in front of thousands of people all the time. He didn't get nervous. But this wasn't nervousness. It was a feeling of being stripped bare. He felt like Alara had reached inside his chest, pulled out his heart and held it up for everyone to see, exposing all the flaws and emptiness that he usually hid behind, his expensive suits and his technical skill. He looked down at his own hands. For years he had thought of his hands as machines of perfection. They could play scales faster than a hummingbird's wings. They could hit every note exactly as the composer intended, with the right dynamic and the right phrasing. He took pride in that. He thought that was what music was, perfection. But listening to Alara had shattered that idea. She had played wrong notes. She had broken rules. Her timing had been uneven, yet it had been the most honest thing he had ever heard. She wasn't playing notes on a page. She was playing a memory. And as Julian stared at her, he began to understand what the melody was saying. He remembered a story he had once read about a man who lost everything. The music Alara played felt like that story. The frantic, rushing rhythm in the middle wasn't just a train. It was the feeling of time running out. The dissonant chords weren't just noise. They were the sound of things not fitting together, of a life that was hard and full of sharp edges. She had played the sound of loneliness so clearly that Julian felt a sudden, sharp ache in his own throat. He realized that for all his money, for all his fame, he had never felt anything as deeply as the woman sitting at the piano in her simple blue dress. Around them, the crowd was shifting. The guests who had been ignoring the piano minutes ago were now pressed in close. Forming a tight semicircle around the instrument, waiters had stopped serving drinks. The bartender was leaning over the counter, watching. Even the band members on the main stage had fallen silent, their instruments lying idle. Julian saw an older woman in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A man in a tuxedo, the kind of man who probably fired people for a living, was standing with his mouth slightly open, staring at Alara as if she were an alien. They were all feeling it. The collective armor of the wealthy, their indifference, their boredom, their superiority, had been cracked open by a few minutes of raw, unfiltered truth. Alara slowly lifted her hands from the keys. The action broke the spell for Julian, but he still couldn't speak. She turned on the bench to face him. Her face was flushed, but her eyes were clear. She looked tired, but there was a peace in her expression that hadn't been there before. She looked at Julian, expecting him to laugh. She expected him to tell her that her rhythm was off, that her technique was sloppy. She expected him to dismiss her, to tell her to go back to the kitchen where she belonged. That was how the world usually worked for people like her. "I'm sorry," Alara said softly, breaking the quiet. "I didn't mean to play so long. I just forgot where I was." Julian tried to find his voice. He wanted to say something witty, something to regain his composure. He wanted to critique her performance, to point out that she had broken the rules of counterpoint. But the words wouldn't come. How do you critique a storm? How do you tell someone their heartache was musically incorrect? You didn't play wrong notes," Julian stammered. It wasn't what he wanted to say, but it was the only thing that came out. He sounded clumsy, which terrified him. He was never clumsy. Alara gave him a sad, knowing smile. It wasn't about the notes. It was about the spaces between them. She stood up slowly from the bench. As she did, the reality of the setting came crashing back in. The spell broke completely. The band on the main stage started tuning up again, a loud, piercing trumpet blast that sounded ugly and harsh compared to the silence that had just been there. The chatter in the room began to rise, but it was different now. People were whispering to each other, looking over at Alara with curiosity and respect. A man in a headset, presumably the event manager, rushed over. Looking annoyed that the catering staff was touching the expensive instruments, "Excuse me, miss," he said sharply. "You can't be here. We have the auction starting in 5 minutes." Ilara nodded quickly, shrinking back into herself. The power she had while playing vanished the moment she stepped away from the piano. "I'm going," she said. "I was just leaving." She moved past Julian. As she did, their shoulders almost brushed. He smelled faint soap and fabric softener, the scent of a simple life. He didn't step out of her way. He wanted to grab her arm, to ask her what the song was, to ask her who she had lost. But he stood frozen, his hands clutching the edge of the piano lid so hard his knuckles turned white. He watched her walk away, blending back into the shadows of the room. Disappearing toward the service doors, the crowd began to disperse, drifting back to their tables, but the energy in the room had changed. The artificial glitter of the gala seemed duller now. Julian stood alone by the piano. He looked down at the keys. They looked the same as they had 10 minutes ago. Black and white, ivory and ebony, plastic and wood. But to him, they looked different. They looked like weapons now, capable of wounding or healing. He realized that he had spent his entire life trying to polish the surface of the music, making it shine so bright that no one could see the darkness underneath. Ilara had done the opposite. She had plunged her hands into the darkness and pulled out the light. A wave of shame washed over him. He felt small. In a room full of powerful people, the richest and most influential men and women in the city, Julian felt like the poorest person there. He had everything, yet he had nothing real to give. And the woman with nothing had given them everything. He looked toward the service doors where she had vanished. The manager was already wiping down the piano keys with a rag, patient to get the instrument ready for the real performers. The sight made Julian angry, a hot, sharp anger that surprised him. He wanted to shout at the man to stop, to tell him that no one should touch those keys until he understood what had just happened. Instead, Julian let go of the piano lid. His hands were trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that was raging inside his own chest. He knew he would never forget this night. He knew that the next time he sat down to play Mozart, he would hear Ilara's storm in the back of his mind. The challenge was over. He had lost. And in losing, he felt like he had just begun to learn what music actually was. Ilara walked away from the piano, her heart still beating fast against her ribs. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her back, burning into her simple blue dress, but she didn't look back. She just wanted to disappear. The magic of the music was fading, replaced by the cold, hard reality of where she was and who she was. She was a server, a worker from the background, not a performer. She had broken the rules, and now she just hoped she wouldn't get in trouble. She kept her head down, slipping past a waiter carrying a tray of empty glasses and ducking behind a heavy velvet curtain that led to the service. Hallway. Back in the corner of the ballroom, the silence stretched on. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the heavy, shocked silence that comes after a disaster or a miracle. No one moved. No one spoke. The air seemed to vibrate with the memory of the sound. Julian stood frozen by the side of the Steinway. His hands were still gripping the polished edge of the piano, his knuckles white. He felt like a statue that had been left out in the rain for too long, cracked on the inside, barely holding it together. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, trying to file it away into the neat boxes of logic and theory he had built his life around. But it wouldn't fit. The music refused to be categorized. It was too big, too messy, too real. The event manager with the headset stepped forward, breaking the spell. He clapped his hands together once, a sharp, dismissive sound that seemed incredibly loud. "All right, everyone, show's over," he announced, his voice brisk and annoyed. "Please, return to your seats. The live auction is about to begin. We need to clear this area." The sound of his voice acted like a switch. The enchantment that held the crowd snapped. People began to blink, looking at each other as if waking up from a dream. They started to move, shuffling their feet, adjusting their cufflinks, and straightening their gowns. The spell was broken, and they were already trying to pretend they hadn't been moved to tears by a woman in a navy dress. They began to drift back toward the banquet tables, whispering to each other. Did you know who that was? Julian heard a woman ask behind him. No, never saw her before, a man replied. Must be a hired act. Very avant-garde. Julian wanted to turn around and scream at them. Asterisk. She wasn't an act. She wasn't avant-garde. He wanted to tell them that she was real, that she had poured her soul out onto the keys, and that they were insulting her by treating it like a cocktail party trick. But the words died in his throat. He realized with a sudden bitter clarity that these people would never understand. They lived in a world of surfaces, of shiny things, and safe emotions. Alara's music was too dangerous for them. It was too honest. The event manager looked at Julian, obviously impatient. Mr. Thorne, sir? We need to close the piano up now. The auctioneer needs the microphone. Julian looked at the man, then down at the keyboard. The manager reached out with a rag to wipe the keys, presumably to clean them after Alara had touched them. Julian's hand shot out and grabbed the manager's wrist. Don't, Julian said. His voice was low, rougher than usual. The manager froze, looking shocked. Excuse me, sir. Don't touch them, Julian repeated, his eyes locking onto the manager's. Leave it. Just leave it. He let go of the man's wrist and took a step back. The manager looked at him like he was crazy, but he pulled his hand back, muttering something under his breath about celebrities being difficult. Julian stood alone again. He looked at the spot where Alara had sat. The bench was still warm. He felt a profound sense of loss. It was a strange feeling. He didn't even know this woman. He had only met her 20 minutes ago. But he felt like he had just lost a friend or missed a chance to meet the most important person in his life. He realized that he had let his arrogance blind him. He had looked at her clothes and her job and thought he knew her story. But she had shown him that he knew nothing. He looked at the guests taking their seats. They were laughing again, sipping their wine, checking their phones. They were talking about stocks and vacations and upcoming polo matches. It all seemed so hollow to Julian now. It felt like noise. Meaningless, empty noise. He looked down at his own hands. For years, he had believed that he was the master of the piano. He thought that because he could play faster and more accurately than anyone else, he owned the music. But standing there, he realized he was just a custodian. He polished the brass and swept the floors. But he didn't live in the house. Alara lived in the house. She had invited him in for a few brief minutes, showed him the view, and then locked the door. A slow round of applause started from the back of the room near the bar. It was hesitant at first. Then, a few more people joined in. Within seconds, the applause grew. It wasn't the polite clapping for a speech. It was rhythmic and intense. Heads were turning back toward the piano, eyes searching for Alara. Encore. Someone shouted, "Where is she?" Another voice cried out, "Play another." Julian looked toward the curtain where she had vanished. He knew she wasn't coming back. She wasn't a performer who needed applause. She had played because she was challenged, and she had left because she had nothing left to prove. The applause was for a ghost. The applause washed over Julian, but he didn't move. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He felt like a fraud accepting credit for a masterwork he hadn't created. He was just the man standing next to the piano. The music hadn't come from him. It had come through him, or perhaps in spite of him. The noise of the crowd began to fade into the background for Julian. He felt a strange peace settle over him. The arrogance, the need to be the best, the constant judgment of everyone around him, it all seemed to melt away. The ice around his heart had been shattered by the sound of her playing. He realized that he had to change. He couldn't go back to playing notes perfectly. He had to learn how to play feelings imperfectly. He had to find the courage to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to be human. It was a terrifying thought, but also an exciting one. Julian took one last look at the piano. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the keys, but he didn't press them down. He knew that whatever he played now would sound like a whisper compared to her shout, and that was okay. He was finally ready to listen. He turned away from the instrument, ignoring the people calling his name, ignoring the waiters trying to offer him more champagne. He walked slowly toward the exit, his hands in his pockets, his mind racing with the melody she had left behind. He walked out of the Grand Hyatt and into the cool night air, leaving the party behind, leaving his old self behind, carrying only the memory of the simple lady who had frozen his heart and set it free.